You built nothing. You inherited dirt and called it a ranch." Earl Vance said it loud enough for the whole dining hall to hear, and he smiled while he said it, the kind of smile a man wears when he already knows he's won. Grace Whitfield didn't flinch. She set her water glass down without a sound and looked at him the way she looked at a ledger that didn't balance. Patient, searching for the error, certain there was. "My father built that mill with his own hands," she said. "Brick by brick, beam by beam. I don't see what part of that is inheritance and what part is dirt." The room went quiet enough to hear the chandelier creak. Beside her, a man in a worn canvas coat set down his fork, slow and deliberate, like he was putting away a tool he didn't need yet but might. "She's worth more than every deed you've forged this year, Vance," he said, "and we both know how many that is." Nobody at that table laughed. Nobody breathed for a moment, because the man they'd invited to be humiliated alongside her had just turned the whole evening inside out, and Earl Vance's smile had nowhere left to go. If you're enjoying this story so far, hit subscribe and stay with us. We've got the whole journey ahead, and trust me, it's worth the ride. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We love hearing how far these stories travel. Grace Whitfield had been raised to believe that paper told the truth, even when people didn't. Her father, Samuel Whitfield, used to say it while he sat at the roll-top desk in the back office of the grist mill, ink-stained fingers moving over columns of numbers like he was reading scripture. "People lie, Gracie," he'd say. "Numbers don't. A ledger can't smile at you and rob you blind at the same time." She was 11 the first time he let her balance the books, and she'd loved it instantly. The way the columns clicked into place when she found the right answer, the satisfaction of a sum that finally agreed with itself. She didn't know then that she'd spend the next 15 years of her life chasing that same feeling through documents that refused to agree, through papers that had been altered just enough to fool anyone who didn't look as closely as she did. The mill sat on the eastern bend of Coldwater Creek outside the town of Briar Hollow, Montana Territory, and for 30 years it had ground wheat for half the county. Samuel built it himself in 1851, the year before he married, and he ran it until the winter he died, which was 8 years before this story starts. When Grace was 22 and suddenly alone with a business she didn't fully understand how to keep. She'd learned fast. She had to. There wasn't anyone left to learn it for her. What she hadn't learned fast enough, what she hadn't seen coming at all, was Earl Vance. He arrived in Briar Hollow the same year her father died, bought up the old Lassiter spread to the north, and within 5 years owned more land than anyone in the territory except the railroad itself. He was charming in the particular way that wealthy men are charming when they've never once been told no and didn't intend to start being told it now. He smiled at church socials. He donated to the building fund for the new schoolhouse. He shook every hand in town at least twice. And underneath all of it, quiet as rot, in a beam you can't see until the roof comes down, he was buying up water rights along Coldwater Creek, one parcel at a time, and Grace's mill sat dead in the middle of the stretch he wanted most. He'd offered to buy her out 3 times. Each time she'd said no. Each time the offer dropped, like he was testing how desperate she'd get, like a man pressing on a bruise to see how much pain it would take before she gave in. She never gave in. That was the trouble with Earl Vance. He wasn't used to people who didn't give in, and trouble had a way of making men like him careless, which was the only reason Grace ever found out what he was really doing. It started with a letter that didn't make sense, a notice from the Territorial Water Commission informing her that her father's original water rights, filing from 1851, had been found deficient, that the claim had technically lapsed 11 years ago due to a clerical oversight, and that the rights to that stretch of Coldwater Creek had since been reassigned to Earl Vance. Grace read the letter 4 times standing in her own kitchen, and each time the words meant the same impossible thing. She knew her father's filing. She'd seen the original document 100 times, framed it once, and then taken it down because her mother said it was bad luck to frame paperwork like it was a wedding photograph. The filing was sound. She would have staked her life on it. So she did the only thing that made sense to a woman raised by Samuel Whitfield. She went looking for proof. That was how she met Caleb Reyes, though not in any way either of them would have chosen. Caleb owned the cattle operation just south of her mill, 200 acres he'd bought with Army discharge pay, and 8 years of work that had turned his hands into something closer to leather than skin. He kept to himself mostly, Folks in Briar Hollow knew him as polite, capable, and almost entirely silent, the kind of man you could work alongside for a season and still not know much more about than his name. He'd lost his right leg below the knee at a place called Chickamauga, and walked now with a cane he'd carved himself, a fact he discussed with exactly no one and resented exactly no one for noticing, which most people had the sense not to do twice. What Grace didn't know, walking into the county recorder's office on a gray Tuesday morning, with her father's water rights filing folded in her coat pocket, was that Caleb had been having his own trouble with Earl Vance for the better part of a year. Trouble involving a boundary survey that had mysteriously shifted 40 feet onto his land, and a county surveyor who'd suddenly come into enough money to build a new barn the same month the survey changed. She found him at the recorder's counter, arguing quietly but firmly with a clerk who kept repeating that the records were the records, and there was nothing to be done about it. Grace recognized the tone in the clerk's voice immediately, the particular flatness of a man who'd been told what to say, and was saying it like it cost him nothing to say it, when clearly it did. "You too?" Grace asked. Before she'd decided to say anything at all, Caleb turned. He had a quiet face, the kind that gave away less than it took in. "Ma'am, the records," she said, suddenly wrong in a way that helps exactly one man in this county. Something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or relief at not being alone in it. "Caleb Reyes," he said, and held out his hand. "Grace Whitfield." She shook it. Her father had taught her that too. Shake firm, look a man in the eye, don't apologize for taking up space in a room you have every right to be in. They didn't solve anything that day. The clerk wouldn't budge. The records stayed wrong. And Grace walked back to her mill with the same impossible letter in her pocket and no more answers than she'd had that morning. But she had a name now, someone else who'd been quietly robbed by paperwork that smiled at you while it lied. And in a town where everyone seemed determined not to see what was happening, that counted for something. Over the following weeks, what started as two people comparing complaints became something more deliberate. Caleb had kept records of his own, correspondence with the surveyor's office, a hand-drawn map of his original boundary lines compared against the new ones, dates that lined up suspiciously close to deposits at the bank that the surveyor had no business making on his salary. Grace had her father's original filing and a memory for detail sharp enough to spot the difference between his actual signature and the one on file at the Water Commission, which was close, very close, but not quite right in the slope of the W. "Forge," she said, the first time she laid the two signatures side by side at her kitchen table, lamp burning low because it was well past dark, and neither of them had noticed. Not badly. Whoever did this had seen my father's hand enough times to get the shape mostly right. But the pressure's wrong. My father pressed hard on the downstroke of the W every time his whole life. Whoever forged this didn't know that, because nobody knows a man's signature like the people who watched him write it 1,000 times. Caleb studied it a long moment. "You sound certain." "I am certain." She looked up at him. "The question is whether anyone in this territory will believe a woman's certainty over a filed government document." He didn't answer right away, and when he did, it wasn't reassurance, which she appreciated more than she expected to. "Probably not," he said. "Not on your word alone. But documents can be checked against other documents. And if your father's signature is wrong here, it might be wrong somewhere else too. Forgers get lazy. They reuse what works." It was the first time in 8 years that someone had looked at her problem and treated it like a puzzle that could actually be solved, rather than a loss she was meant to grieve and move past. She didn't say any of that to him, but she thought about it for a long time after he left that night, longer than she meant to. What followed was the slow, unglamorous work of building a case, which is to say it was nothing like the stories made it sound. There were no chases, no confrontations at gunpoint, no dramatic discoveries in a single afternoon. There was Grace spending her evenings in the back room of the county recorder's office, after the regular clerk went home, and a sympathetic night clerk named Otis let her in because her father had once forgiven his family's milling debt during a hard winter, and Otis hadn't forgotten it. There was Caleb riding 2 counties over to the Territorial Land Office in Helena to request copies of original filings that hadn't passed through Earl Vance's reach yet. There were nights Grace fell asleep at her kitchen table, with ink on her fingers, and woke up with crick in her neck, and the same nagging conviction that the truth was in there somewhere, in the gap between what the record said now and what they used to say. It took 4 months to find the pattern. 4 months and 7 other families. 7. Beyond Grace and Caleb, whose land or water rights had been quietly reassigned through clerical corrections over the past 5 years, all of them benefiting, eventually, either directly or through a chain of shell purchases. Earl Vance. The Dunmores, who'd lost their eastern pasture to a boundary dispute that never should have existed. The Okafor family, formerly enslaved people who'd homesteaded 80 acres after the war and built a life on it, whose original claim had been ruled incomplete on a technicality that conveniently surfaced the same year Vance wanted the parcel for a rail spur. An elderly widow named Mrs. Petrakis, whose husband's mining claim had been reassigned after his death on the grounds that the filing had lapsed. Except Grace found the renewal receipt herself, buried under a different filing date in a drawer that should have been empty. Every single case ran through the same surveyor, the same clerk who'd been suspiciously firm with Caleb that first day, and a notary named Wendell Crow whose stamp appeared on every single fraudulent document, always slightly smudged in the same corner, like he was in too much of a hurry or too guilty to press it square. Grace started keeping a separate ledger just for the pattern: dates, names, document numbers, discrepancies. She filled it the way she'd once filled her father's account books, methodically, without flourish, because the truth didn't need flourish. It only needed to be complete. "You know what happens if you bring this forward," Caleb said one evening, watching her write by lamplight. "Vance has money. He has lawyers. He has half the county council in his pocket, or close enough, I know. He could ruin you before this ever sees a judge." "He's already trying to ruin me," Grace said, not looking up from the page. "The only difference is whether I let him do it quietly or make him do it where people can see." Caleb didn't argue after that. He just kept writing to Helena, kept bringing back documents, kept showing up at her kitchen table 4 nights a week with a coffee tin full of his own findings, and a patience that never once made her feel like she was asking too much of him, which was new, because most people in her life had made her feel exactly that, eventually, even when they didn't mean to. It was during those months that Grace noticed something she hadn't expected to notice. Caleb Reyes did not talk much, but when he did, he never wasted a word, and he never once made her explain herself twice. When she got frustrated and slammed a hand flat on the table because a discrepancy wouldn't resolve, he didn't tell her to calm down. He just waited, the way you wait out weather, certain it would pass on its own. When she finally found the thread that connected Mrs. Petrakis's lapsed renewal to the same handwriting that had forged her father's signature, she'd looked up to share the triumph and found him already watching her, like he'd been waiting the whole time for her to get there, confident she would. "You don't quit," he said. It wasn't quite a compliment. It was something steadier than that. "Neither do you," she said. "Most men would have sold out to Vance and moved on by now, taken the money, started over somewhere easier, wasn't raised to start over somewhere easier." He turned his cane slowly between his hands, the way he did when he was about to say something that cost him something to say. "Lost a leg at Chickamauga. Spent 2 years after that, learning to walk again on a piece of wood I carved myself because the Army surgeon's version didn't fit right. I know what it is to rebuild something nobody thinks you can rebuild. I wasn't about to let a man like Vance take the one thing I did manage to build clean, on my own, with both hands I still had." Grace looked at him for a long moment, and something settled in her chest that she didn't examine too closely. Not then. There would be time for that later, she told herself. There was work to finish first. The invitation to Earl Vance's autumn banquet arrived in early October, addressed to Grace personally, which surprised her until she understood why. Vance had heard, somehow, likely through the same clerk who couldn't keep his nerves steady around Caleb, that she'd been asking questions at the recorder's office. He wanted to take her measure. He wanted to remind her, in front of the whole town, exactly how small she was next to him. She almost didn't go. Caleb told her she didn't have to, that they had enough evidence now to take to a federal land inspector without ever stepping into Vance's dining hall. But Grace had inherited more from her father than a head for numbers. She'd inherited his stubbornness, his refusal to let anyone believe they'd won a fight she hadn't finished having. "He wants to humiliate me in front of everyone," she said. "Fine, let him try. I'd rather he show his hand in public than keep hiding it in the dark." "You're not going alone," Caleb said. It wasn't a question, and she didn't argue with it. The banquet hall was the finest room in Briar Hollow. All white tablecloths and silver Vance had shipped in from Denver specifically to remind everyone what real money looked like. Grace wore her mother's good dress, the deep green one with the high collar, and she walked in with her chin level and her hands steady, because Samuel Whitfield had taught her that fear only shows when you let your hands shake, and hers had never once given her away. Vance found her within the first 10 minutes, smiling that smile, steering the conversation in front of half the county council until he landed exactly where he meant to land. "You built nothing," he said, loud enough for the table to hear. "You inherited dirt and called it a ranch." And that was when Caleb set down his fork. What followed wasn't shouted. Caleb's voice never rose above the volume of a man discussing the weather, which made it land harder than shouting ever could have. He laid out, calmly, in front of the county council president, the Reverend, 2 bank officers, and Earl Vance himself, the pattern for 4 months assembling, the forged signature, the smudged notary stamp, always in the same corner, the surveyor's new barn, 7 families, 7 parcels, 1 beneficiary. Vance laughed it off at first. Too loud, too fast, the laugh of a man who'd never once needed to defend himself and didn't know how to start. But the room had already gone quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when people are doing arithmetic in their heads and not liking the answer. Mrs. Petrakis, who'd been seated near the back because widows of dead miners didn't rate a good table, stood up. Then old Mr. Dunmore stood. Then, one by one, every family Grace and Caleb had spent 4 months investigating rose from their chairs and walked toward the front of the room, not to make a scene, just to stand together, which turned out to be its own kind of scene entirely. "She's worth more than every deed you've forged this year, Vance," Caleb said again, quieter now that he had the room. "And we both know how many that is." Earl Vance left Briar Hollow's autumn banquet that night still smiling, but it was the wrong kind of smile, the kind a man wears when he's already calculating how much it will cost to make a problem disappear before it reaches a judge. It cost him everything. The federal land inspector arrived 3 weeks later, summoned by a letter Grace had drafted, and 12 people had signed, including Otis, the night clerk, who'd quietly photographed every altered document before it could vanish from the recorder's files. The investigation moved slower than Grace wanted and faster than Vance could buy his way around. By the following spring, Earl Vance was indicted on 11 counts of land fraud, 3 counts of bribery of a public official, and 1 count of conspiracy. He hired lawyers out of Denver who delayed and objected and appealed with every tool the law allowed, and none of it mattered, because the evidence was complete and the witnesses were many, and the case had been built not by powerful men but by a miller's daughter who'd spent 4 months reading documents by lamplight because her father raised her to believe numbers, told the truth even when people didn't. Vance was convicted that June. His properties were seized and the stolen parcels returned, one by one, to the families who'd been robbed of them. The Dunmores got their eastern pasture back. The Okafor family's 80 acres were restored, the original homestead claim reinstated in full, with a formal letter of correction from the Territorial Land Office that Grace kept a copy of in her own files, just to be certain it could never quietly disappear again. Mrs. Petrakis got her husband's mining claim back, though she chose to sell it not long after and move closer to her daughter in Helena, which Grace understood completely. Caleb's land was returned to its original boundary, the surveyor's altered lines struck from the record and the real ones restored, the same 40 acres he'd worked for 8 years finally, fully, undeniably his again. Grace's water rights were reinstated on a gray morning in late October, almost exactly a year after the letter that started everything. She rode out to the bend in Coldwater Creek, where her father had built the mill, and she stood there a long time, listening to the water move, the way it had moved since before she was born. The way it had kept moving the whole time, someone tried to take it from her on paper, while it never once stopped belonging to the land it ran through. Caleb drove her out in his wagon. Neither of them spoke much on the way. Some things don't need narration, they need space. She knelt by the creek bank and pressed her palm flat against the cold ground, the same ground her father had stood on the day he laid the mill's first foundation stone, and she said, quietly, "Not really to Caleb, not really to anyone. We kept it, Pa." Her voice didn't shake. She'd promised herself it wouldn't, and Samuel Whitfield's daughter didn't break promises she made to herself in front of running water. When she stood and turned back, Caleb was waiting by the wagon, same as always, patient as weather. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. The nights at my kitchen table. The rides to Helena. Standing up in front of the whole county when you didn't have to." "I did have to," he said. "Same reason I went looking into my own boundary lines instead of just taking Vance's word for it. The only thing worse than somebody robbing you blind is watching it happen to your neighbor, and telling yourself it's none of your business." Grace studied him the way she studied a column of figures that wouldn't quite balance, looking for the flaw, the thing that didn't add up. She didn't find one. She hadn't found one in 4 months of looking, which she understood. Finally, standing there with cold creek water on her palm was its own kind of answer. "I'm going to rebuild the mill bigger," she said. "Add a proper office. Start keeping records for other families too. Water rights, land claims, anything that needs a second set of eyes that knows what a forged signature looks like up close. I won't let what happened to the Okafors or Mrs. Petrakis happen again to anyone in this county. Not while I'm alive to stop it. You'll need help running an operation like that. I'll need a great many things." She almost smiled, which for Grace Whitfield was the equivalent of most people laughing out loud. "I was thinking I might need someone who already knows how to keep his own boundary lines straight." Caleb looked at her a long moment, the same steady look he'd given her, across a kitchen table for 4 months running, the look of a man who didn't say more than he meant and didn't mean less than he said. "The east pasture's still mine," he said. "Plenty of room for a mill office, if a person wanted to build one close AO. I don't need an office, Caleb. I need a partner. Somebody who understands that fighting for what's right isn't a thing you do once and then go back to minding your own business. It's a daily practice. Somebody who won't flinch when it gets hard again, because it will get hard again." "I don't flinch," he said. "I know. That's why I'm asking." He reached out and took her hand, not the careful, uncertain way he'd reached for it that first day at the recorder's counter, a stranger's handshake offered and accepted and let go. He took it the way a man takes something he intends to keep, firm and unhurried, like there was no question left worth asking. "Then you've got one," he said. They stood together at the bend in Coldwater Creek, on land that had been stolen and returned and would never be taken so easily again, and they didn't make any promises out loud, because promises are only words, and words can be forged just as easily as a signature. What passed between them instead was a decision, built the same slow, careful way Grace built every column of figures that mattered. Checked twice, certain, grounded in 4 months of proof that the person standing beside her would still be standing there when the next hard thing came. The county council seat Earl Vance had once controlled went, the following year, to Reuben Dunmore, who ran on a single promise, that every land claim in Briar Hollow would be checked twice before it was ever called settled. Otis, the night clerk, was promoted to chief recorder and spent the rest of his career double-stamping anything that crossed his desk, a habit nobody ever had the heart to tease him out of, given what his careful eye had once helped uncover. Wendell Crow, the notary, served 14 months in territorial prison and afterward took up honest bookkeeping work for the very families he'd once helped rob, free of charge, for as long as any of them would let him. Grace Whitfield became Grace Reyes the following spring, married on the porch of Caleb's ranch house, with the whole of Briar Hollow in attendance, including every family who'd once stood up together in Earl Vance's banquet hall and walked toward the front of the room rather than stay seated and silent. She rebuilt her father's mill that same year, twice the size it had been, with a second office where she spent 2 afternoons a week reviewing water claims and boundary filings for anyone in the county who asked, charging nothing for families who couldn't pay, and exactly enough for those who could to keep the whole operation running. Caleb kept ranching. He kept his fence lines straight and his cattle fed and his water clean, and every season at planting time, he and Grace walked the boundary together, just to be certain, not because they doubted the records anymore, but because some habits, once a person learns the cost of not keeping them, never quite go away. They sent a poor woman to be shamed in front of the whole county, and the rancher said she was worth more than every deed the richest man in the territory had ever forged. But the truth ran deeper than that single evening. The truth was that paper could be altered, and land could be stolen, and even water rights could be twisted on a page until they said something they never meant. But the 4 months Grace Whitfield spent reading by lamplight, refusing to let a lie stand simply because it had been filed correctly. That belonged to her completely, and no smudged notary stamp on this earth could ever take it back.